It was the summer of 1944 when the last of the hospital tents fell silent on the island of Luzon. The air hung thick with smoke and the smell of iodine. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the guns were still thundering, but here only the moans of the wounded remained. Among them moved a young woman in a torn white uniform, her hands trembling around a blood-stained bandage. Her name was Keiko, though few called her that anymore. To her commanders she was Nurse 26, a body trained to obey, to bind wounds and silence screams. The light in her eyes had long since dimmed, burned out by discipline and fear. In her country, emotion was indulgence, a smile was betrayal. And so she forgot how. Keiko's world had been built on a single phrase drilled into her every morning: better to die than surrender. It was the prayer whispered in the academy halls, the code sewn into her uniform. Her father had said it again the day she left home, his voice steady as if he were blessing her. "If you are captured, daughter, your duty will not end. It will only change form." She had understood. Death, she believed, would be her final act of loyalty. But the war had other plans. When the bombing came, it was not heroic. The sky tore open and the ground swallowed sound. She woke beneath a collapsed tent, her leg torn, her stretcher mates gone. For hours she crawled through mud and ashes, clutching a scrap of white cloth she'd found by chance. By the time she reached the American lines, she had stopped being a soldier. The surrender came quietly, knees in the dirt, hands shaking, lips too dry to form the words. The men who lifted her did not spit. They did not strike. One brushed dust from her cheek with a handkerchief. Another muttered something she could not understand. She braced herself for cruelty, but instead they gave her water. It was a mercy she did not know how to receive. Kindness, she told herself, was just another weapon, sharper than pain because it demanded no defense. Weeks passed in transit, first through the islands, then across the ocean. The ship that carried her to America was crowded with silence. At night she lay awake, the sea heaving like breath beneath her, wondering what awaited her on the other side. When the train finally stopped in Texas, she expected barbed wire and shouting. Instead she saw order. Fences trimmed, barracks neat as schoolhouses, men with rifles held low, not as threats but as habit. The sky stretched above her, wider than any she had ever seen, careless and unbroken. Processing took hours. Names were checked, numbers issued, soap distributed. The guards spoke softly, their words clipped but calm. She did not understand them, yet their tone unnerved her more than shouting would have. This was not the war she had prepared for. The camp smelled of starch and dust, not blood. Her assigned cot was thin, but it did not hurt. Her first night she could not sleep. Through the slats she saw stars like pinpricks in dark cloth, too bright, too many. Somewhere outside a harmonica drifted in the wind, uneven and strange. The tune was foreign, the rhythm uncertain, yet something in it felt almost familiar. The sound of a world that had not yet burned. The next morning the bell rang, not a barked command but a chime. The women lined up for breakfast. Keiko's stomach twisted. She did not trust food that was not rationed by suffering, but when the lid of the pan lifted, a scent rose that struck through every wall she had built. Bacon, thick, salty, alive. The smell crashed into her like memory. Her father once brought home a sliver of it from the black market before the war. Her mother had cried as she cooked it, guilty and grateful. That scent had vanished with the first air raid. Now it returned, rising from a steel tray in enemy hands. The woman serving it was blonde, unsmiling. She spooned eggs beside the slice and slid the plate forward. Keiko bowed instinctively and took it with both hands. The first bite nearly undid her. It was too rich, too hot, too alive. It filled her throat until she could not breathe. For a heartbeat she thought she might weep, not from sadness but from recognition. The warmth in her mouth felt like a lie she wanted to believe. This was food for humans, not prisoners, and that was what frightened her most. That night she sat awake on her cot, the scent of the meal still lingering on her skin. Across the barracks someone whispered a prayer. Outside, the same harmonica played, softer this time, rising and fading like the wind through tall grass. She closed her eyes and let it reach her. The tune carried no meaning, no language, yet it stirred something long buried, the echo of laughter, of kindness, of a world where voices did not always wound. She did not smile, she could not. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the shame, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not hope, just the smallest reminder that she was still capable of feeling. And in a place built to erase her identity, that tiny spark of memory was rebellion enough. The camp hours moved like beads on a string. Breakfast, roll call, work detail. Keiko learned the rhythm by watching, not asking. Questions still felt dangerous. She kept to the laundry tents where steam rose from tubs and the air smelled of soap and iron. American uniforms turned heavy in the water. She wrung them with the same precision once used on bandages. Precision was its own language. Obedience kept breath in the body. By the third week, the sharp fear faded, replaced by a thinner one, the fear of turning soft. Men had taught her that softness was a trap. In the academy they had cut her hair blunt and made her balance books until her neck burned. They used words like purity and duty until they broke. She learned stillness the way others learned prayer, even here. Where the worst sound each night was a harmonica struggling for tune, she wore that stillness like armor. It began on a day without meaning. The sun stood white and merciless. Dust clung to everything. The women carried baskets toward the lines where shirts would flap toward dryness. Keiko's palms were raw from bleach. She shifted the basket higher and felt the old ache in her thigh where shrapnel had written its small scar. She set the basket down, breathing through the sting. He was already there, the tall guard with a hat that shaded his eyes. She had seen him before. He didn't pace like the others. He leaned, listened to wind, chewed a blade of grass as if there were no war to hurry. His shirt was always half untucked, as if the day itself had pressed its thumb into him. When he looked at prisoners, he didn't count them. He seemed to check that the sky still existed. Her first rule was simple: do not be seen. She kept her face turned, her posture flat enough to vanish into the heat. She tied the first wet shirt to the line, then the second. The cotton slapped her wrist, a fly traced circles near her cheek. She didn't brush it away. Then came a low voice. "Ma'am, I hope I'm not out of line, but that's the prettiest damn frown I've ever seen." The words didn't rush, they walked. Each rolled through the air like pebbles in slow water. She didn't move. The women beside her froze. Someone drew a breath. Someone whispered a prayer that never reached sound. Keiko bit her lip, not from shame or fear, but from a warmth she couldn't name. In her world, compliments were charges. If a man noticed you, you had failed. If a man spoke, you had invited it. That was what the instructors said, their voices sharp with righteousness. You were to be useful, not seen, stone, not water. Now a sentence had crossed the fence without a blade in it. It landed like a hand offered to steady a fall. She didn't know how to hold such a thing. She waited for laughter that never came. The guard didn't lean closer. He tipped his hat and looked away. The silence he left was heavier than mockery. The women went back to their work awkwardly. Keiko tied another shirt. She could feel their glances. Not envy, not judgment, but a shared question. What did it mean if kindness could cross a fence? When the bell called them to the mess hall, her legs felt heavy. She stared at her food until it blurred. The bacon again. The scent moved like memory. She ate without tasting, hearing only the echo of that strange word, prettiest, grinding against older ones carved in her bones. Better to die than surrender. The two thoughts collided and stayed. That night the barracks breathed like a single animal. Cots creaked. A harmonica tried, then gave up. Keiko lay still and studied the moonlight on the window frame. She replayed his tone until it frayed. It hadn't mocked. It hadn't reached for her. It had only named what it saw with a gentleness she hadn't been taught to fear. She tried to condemn it and failed. In the failure was a new danger. The danger of wanting to be seen again. Morning came. Work, water, rope. She didn't look for him, but her eyes knew where not to look. The garden behind the barracks had begun to show green rows, beans pushing through soil. She bent to lift a basket and nearly lost her grip. Another woman caught the other handle. Their eyes met. No words, no permission, just care. He reappeared near the pump, sun catching the dust around him. He wiped his brow and looked toward the space she occupied. Not at her, not away. She wanted to believe the first words had been an accident, a spark that would die. The hope thinned when he lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Just that, a gesture brief as breath. At midday she carried bundles toward the far line. He nodded as if he'd heard an answer anyway and stepped back. The distance shaped a space that didn't wound. In it she recognized something she hadn't known she missed: courtesy. When the others returned, one brushed Keiko's arm with a question in her eyes. Keiko shook her head. The woman nodded and later passed her the water dipper first, a small kindness beside a larger one. As the day thinned, heat clung to the posts. A cloud crossed once. At the fence, the cowboy looked at the horizon and spoke. "Where I'm from, the magnolias bloom even when the air feels mean." She didn't forgive. There was nothing to forgive. She didn't condemn. There was nothing to condemn. She didn't smile, not yet. But the armor of stillness had loosened its seam. Morning would bring the same rope, the same shirts, the same careless sky. The same man might walk by with grass in his teeth and a tune he wasn't ready to play. She wasn't ready to ask his name. He wasn't ready to give it. Between them, something small was forming, careful as a sprout pushing through hard soil. She didn't know it yet, but the next word he chose would change everything. A simple word, a name that would feel like light beneath a door. Texas sun did not rise quietly. It arrived like a command, flooding every corner of the camp in gold that burned without mercy. By mid-morning, heat shimmered above the dirt and turned breath into labor. The prisoners moved slower now, their shadows sharp against the ground. Keiko worked with a towel tied around her neck, sleeves rolled high, her hands raw from soap and bleach. The monotony of laundry work had become her shield. She counted every movement, every fold, as if each repetition might keep her thoughts contained. But thoughts are like water. They find cracks. The nickname began with a whisper. One morning, while she carried a basket of damp uniforms to the drying line, the cowboy stood near the water pump. His hat was tilted, his boots half buried in dust. He wasn't smiling. He looked at the sky as if he could tell the weather from memory. She might have passed him without a word, but then he spoke, that slow drawl stretching words until they sounded half asleep. "You bloom even in heat." For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. Her English was rough, just fragments learned from the guard's orders, but the look on his face made her stop. He saw her confusion and added softly, "Magnolia. That's what you remind me of. Tough flowers stay soft no matter what." Then he tipped his hat and walked away before she could respond. The air seemed to bend around the words, holding them in place long after his footsteps faded. Magnolia. She stood there with the laundry still heavy in her arms. The name felt strange on her tongue. Too gentle for a prisoner, too alive for someone taught that softness was shame. When she returned to the barracks that evening, the other women had already heard. "Rumor travels faster than heat." "Magnolia," one of them whispered, half teasing, half curious. Keiko said nothing, her face flushed, but she didn't deny it. By the next day, someone had scrawled the word in chalk on a laundry bin. She scrubbed it off, but by afternoon it was written again. It was a dangerous kind of joke, yet no one reported it. The guards pretended not to notice. Perhaps they didn't care, or perhaps they understood that a harmless name was better than despair. Still, every time Keiko heard it, a small current of warmth ran through her. Not pride, not joy. Something quieter, a sense of being seen without pain. That frightened her more than punishment ever could. She had spent years learning to disappear, to erase herself in service and silence. Now a single word had begun to pull her back into focus. The days followed the same rhythm. Work in the morning, rations at noon, letters written but never sent in the evening. Yet under the surface something had shifted. She began noticing colors again. The way the sky burned orange before nightfall, the faint green of bean shoots breaking through the soil behind the barracks, the soft gray of the cowboy's uniform dusted with sweat and sunlight. She never spoke to him, not once after that day. He seemed to understand that distance was the only language they could share, but she felt his presence like the echo of music long after it stopped playing. He no longer leaned against the fence to watch her directly. Instead, he worked near the edges of her world, fixing a gate, cleaning his rifle, feeding the camp's horse. Sometimes he would hum under his breath, a low, unsteady tune that reminded her of the harmonica she heard at night. She wondered if it was him, if the music that haunted her dreams belonged to those same rough, calloused hands. The thought unsettled her, but it also comforted her in ways she didn't want to name. In the garden behind the laundry tent, she began to find peace she hadn't known since before the war. The guards had allowed the women to tend small patches of vegetables, carrots, beans, and a few stubborn tomatoes. Working the soil steadied her. The dirt was foreign, but it obeyed the same rules. You watered, waited, and hoped. Each sprout that survived the Texas sun felt like a quiet act of defiance. Life, she realized, was persistent even where it wasn't wanted. Sometimes he would walk by the fence while she worked, his steps slow, almost careful. He never spoke again, but once, when she looked up, she caught his eyes. There was no mockery there, no pity, just something human and unguarded. It made her heart stumble for a beat. She turned away quickly, pretending to adjust the soil. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. It was easier to keep moving than to feel. That night, the word magnolia lingered in her mind like a song she didn't want to forget. She whispered it under her breath, tasting its foreign rhythm. In her old world, names were titles of duty: daughter, nurse, servant of the emperor. This name carried no command, no burden. It was simple, fragile, and hers. For the first time in years, she felt the edges of herself returning, like a photograph slowly developing in sunlight. Days turned into weeks. The women began to call her Magnolia openly now. Sometimes they said it to tease her when she blushed. Sometimes they said it softly when they needed comfort. The name had changed shape. It was no longer just hers, but something they all carried. A small piece of gentleness in a place built on control. When the guard walked by, they straightened their backs but didn't hide their smiles. Even the air around them seemed less heavy. One afternoon, while she pulled weeds from a row of wilted tomatoes, she heard a sound she hadn't heard in days: the harmonica. It came from beyond the fence, slow and clumsy, as if the player were testing old memories. The tune floated across the dust, catching in the wind, trembling like a voice afraid to speak. She froze, hand half buried in the soil, and listened. It wasn't the melody that mattered, it was the fact that someone was playing it, for no reason other than to fill silence with something alive. When the song stopped, she looked up. The harmonica sat on the fence post, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. He was gone. She didn't touch it. She couldn't. Instead, she stayed there until the shadows grew long and the air cooled. Only when another woman called her name, her new name, did she rise and leave. The harmonica was gone by morning, but the silence it left behind no longer felt empty. That night she dreamt of home, not the home of war and fear, but the one from long ago. The smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of her brother's laughter, the warmth of summers before discipline took their place. When she woke, her pillow was damp. She told herself it was sweat, but deep down she knew it wasn't. The Texas heat had a rhythm of its own. It hummed through the wires, pressed against the tin roofs, and made every breath feel like work. The women had learned to move within it, conserving energy as if each step cost something. Keiko spent most mornings in the garden now, her hands sunk deep into soil that no longer felt foreign. Rows of beans curved like sentences she was learning to read. The guards rarely interfered. Even war had limits, and growing food was a language both sides understood. He was there more often now, though never close. Sometimes he walked the perimeter, sometimes leaned near the water pump fixing a loose hinge. The cowboy's presence had become part of the landscape, predictable as sunrise, steady as the dust that clung to every surface. They no longer exchanged words. They didn't need to. The memory of the name he had given her still lingered like perfume that refused to fade. Magnolia. It had changed something in her that could not be undone. One afternoon the sky began to shift. The air thickened, restless. Clouds rolled over the hills like bruises spreading across the horizon. The women whispered that a storm was coming. The guards pretended not to care, but their glances at the sky betrayed unease. Keiko could smell the change before it arrived. The metallic scent of rain meeting dust, the sharp promise of thunder. She worked faster, trying to finish before the weather turned. By the time she carried the last basket back to the barracks, the first drops had fallen, large, warm, and rare. They darkened the ground in uneven circles. The sky cracked open with a sound that shook the wooden walls. She froze in the doorway, heart quickening at the sudden violence of it. For a moment she was back in Luzon. The roar of planes overhead, the world splitting in light. Her breath caught. The air smelled the same, wet smoke, iron and fear. Inside, the other women moved their cots away from the windows. The wind pressed against the barracks like a living thing. Then the rain came harder, a wall of sound beating the roof until conversation was useless. Keiko sat on her bunk, knees drawn up, arms wrapped tight around herself. Lightning flashed, and in that instant she saw the faces of those around her, pale and still, eyes wide as if the past had burst through the walls. When darkness returned, someone began to cry softly. No one told her to stop. The power went out. The single bulb above them flickered once and died, leaving only the sound of rain and the creak of the wooden beams. Then, through the storm came something else, a faint, trembling note. The harmonica. At first she thought it was her imagination, a trick of wind moving through a crack in the boards. But then it came again, low, hesitant, the melody wobbling like a candle flame. It wasn't the same song she had heard weeks ago. This one was slower, sadder, as if the air itself was trying to remember how to breathe. The sound cut through the storm, soft but steady like the heartbeat of something still alive. The women fell silent. Even the one who had been crying stopped mid-breath. No one spoke. The music wandered through the dark, filling the space between thunderclaps. The notes carried no words, yet each one said what speech could not. Keiko closed her eyes. She didn't need to see him to know it was him. The same uneven rhythm, the same restraint, as if he played not to comfort but to confess. The melody rose, faltered, then found itself again. In that wavering song, she heard something she hadn't allowed herself to feel, grace. Not the grace of forgiveness, but the grace of simply being remembered. For the first time since the war began, she wasn't invisible. Someone beyond the fence knew she existed and thought her worth a song. A flash of lightning split the sky, painting the room in white. For a heartbeat, she saw the outline of the women around her, each face turned toward the window, listening. In that brief light, they didn't look like prisoners. They looked like witnesses. The thunder rolled again, shaking the floorboards, and the harmonica played louder, refusing to be drowned. The sound carried memories she didn't want to revisit. Her mother's voice reciting prayers, the hush of hospital wards where men breathed their last, the silence after surrender. But woven through it all was something new, the quiet defiance of a man who had chosen melody over orders. She could almost see him, standing somewhere near the fence, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, hands steady on the small silver instrument. Minutes passed before the song began to fade. It ended the way it had begun, gently, as if it had never been meant for an audience. When the last note vanished, the only sound left was the rain softening into mist. No one moved. Keiko sat perfectly still, her pulse echoing in her ears. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. When the lights flickered back on, some of the women smiled faintly at each other, embarrassed by how much the moment had mattered. Others wiped their faces quickly, pretending it was rain that had found its way through the roof. Keiko didn't move. Her hands rested on her knees, palms open, as if she were still holding the sound. The next morning the world was washed clean. The air was cooler, the sky a pale blue that looked almost tender. The ground squelched underfoot as the women went back to work. The guards were quieter than usual, their voices careful. Keiko's hair clung damp against her neck as she bent to pick up a basket of folded uniforms. Across the yard she saw him walking the fence line, boots muddy, sleeves rolled up, head bowed as if he were deep in thought. He didn't look at her, but he didn't need to. Something had already passed between them, something that couldn't be taken back. When she reached the garden, she found a single harmonica reed lying in the dirt near the gate, bent, tarnished, almost useless. She brushed it clean with her thumb and tucked it into her pocket without thinking. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a message. It was a trace, a reminder that silence too could speak. That night she didn't write in her notebook. The words would have felt too small. She sat on her bunk, fingers grazing the fragment of metal, and listened to the quiet breathing of those around her. For the first time, the stillness didn't feel like confinement. It felt like peace. In the weeks that followed, the harmonica never played again. Maybe the cowboy had been warned. Maybe he had simply said all he needed to. But sometimes when the wind moved across the camp just right, she thought she could still hear it. the faint echo of music meant for no one and somehow meant for her. The war continued elsewhere. Rumors drifted through the camp like pollen. Battles ending, cities falling, nations bending under exhaustion. None of it mattered here. What mattered was that for a single stormy night, the fence had vanished. The barbed wire had become a string between two souls, stretched tight, humming softly in the rain. And when she lay down to sleep, her last thought was not of fear or duty, but of sound, low, human, and fragile as breath. And when she lay down to sleep, her last thought was not of fear or duty, but of sound, low, human, and fragile as breath. This went up at dawn on a sheet of plywood beside the mess hall. It was written in English with smaller Japanese below it, stiff and clipped like a translation done by a careful hand. Prisoners may compose letters to family. Paper will be provided, all mail subject to inspection. 10 lines only. Sign with given name and camp number. The line formed before breakfast, quiet as a chapel. No one wanted to be first. Everyone wanted to be first. Keiko took the pencil when it reached her, a short stub already flattened on one side. The guard at the table did not look at faces, only fingers, as if the act of writing were the only identity that mattered. 10 lines. Her hands felt suddenly too large for the page. What did truth look like when each stroke might be questioned and each word could travel farther than she would for months or years? She pressed the pencil down and drew a single character. It broke. The guard replaced it without a word. That small, unremarkable kindness steadied her, and the point met the paper again. She began with a date, the way her father taught her to begin all serious things. She wrote her mother's name and the name of the street that might no longer exist. Her throat tightened at the risk that the letter would arrive at rubble. Then came the impossible choice. What do you tell a family that taught you that silence is dignity and endurance is proof? She tried duty first. I am healthy, I am working, I am obedient. The words lay there like dull buttons sewn to the wrong coat. She lifted the page so her eyes were level with it and waited for a sentence to choose her instead. It arrived soft as breath. Today someone called me something kind. She stopped as if she had touched a hot pot. The sentence both warmed and accused. Would her mother see betrayal in it? Would a censor see a code? Would anyone believe that captivity could hold gentleness? She did not cross it out. She let the words be a small rebellion against the version of herself. That had only ever been a blade. 10 lines were nearly gone. She ended with the plainest truth she could bear. I am being fed. I sleep. The sky here is very large. Then she signed the number the Americans had given her and folded the paper as if it were skin. Around her, the other women argued with paper that did not answer back. One wrote 3 versions and tore each in half. Another wrote only 7 words and handed it in before she could lose her courage. A third asked a guard, in careful English, if she might write 2 letters in case the first sank at sea. The guard said no, and then, after a pause, slid a second sheet anyway. Rules bent when no one was watching. Mercy sometimes looked like procrastination. The letters were collected in a wooden tray by a corporal with a shy mustache. He stacked them like tiles and carried them inside. Keiko watched the tray disappear through the doorway and felt a tug in her chest as if a wire tied somewhere beneath her ribs had been pulled. It would be weeks before any answer could come, if an answer could come at all. She returned to the laundry tent with a strange lightness in her limbs, as if the paper had left carrying some weight for her. The lightness lasted until the bell for lunch, then turned into a hollow. What had she done? What if kindness on a page was the final failure in a family that had expected her to keep the code even in chains? That evening the yard cooled, and the wind carried the smell of wet soil from the garden. The cowboy walked the far fence as if measuring the distance between 2 states of mind. He did not look toward the barracks, but he slowed near the water pump and tested the handle twice, though it did not need testing. Keiko stood behind the screen door where shadows hid her shape. She tried to imagine his life before the fence. Had he grown up with fields that did not end? Did he have a mother who measured love in quiet dinners? Did he ever learn a code that required a man to leave feelings in the barn when he came inside? She did not know, yet she felt the pull of questions that had never mattered before. The next day, a crate of lined paper arrived from town. The quartermaster separated it into bundles with twine and gave one to each barracks like a ration of breath. The women began to write for themselves now, on scraps that would never meet the censor's eyes. Keiko folded a few sheets into a small book and hid it beneath the straw of her mattress. These were the words she would not send. I woke to the sound of rain and did not think of bombs. A guard returned a pencil I dropped and did not keep it. Today a woman shared her bread with me because my hands shook. She discovered that writing smuggled time. On paper she could pause a moment that would otherwise slide past. She could hold a sound in place long enough to understand it. When she wrote the word magnolia, her chest ached, but it was the ache of a wound that had begun to knit. She did not use his name because she did not know it. She used the shape of him instead. The hat, the steady hands, the way he left a harmonica on a fence post and never asked for it back. On the fourth evening, as the light thinned to orange, the corporal posted a second notice under the first. Some letters returned. Too damaged by rain to send. Claim if yours. The women crowded close, wary and hopeful. Keiko pressed forward with them, her breath caught between ribs. The tray on the table held a small stack of wavy envelopes, each with brown stains along the edges, as if they had tried to drink the storm. She scanned the handwriting on each, searching for her own hard square strokes. Her letter was not there. Relief rose first, then dread. If it had not drowned, it would sail. If it sailed, it might land. If it landed, what would it break? That night she dreamed of home again. She stood in a kitchen that smelled of miso and ash. It happened without warning. The morning bell rang late, and for the first time since her capture, the guards did not shout the roll call. The air was too still, too expectant, as if the camp itself were holding its breath. Keiko stood with the other women outside the barracks, sunlight washing over their faces, each waiting for someone else to explain the silence. Then a guard with a radio tucked under his arm walked toward the mess hall, his face pale and unreadable. The faint crackle of static followed him. A few seconds later the voice came, thin and distant, like wind traveling through tin. No one in the yard could understand the English words, but they felt the shift anyway. The guards froze. One man lowered his hat and rubbed his eyes. Another sat down abruptly on a crate and stared at nothing. When the interpreter finally arrived, his tone carried no emotion. He cleared his throat and said the words in Japanese so plainly they felt unreal. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. The sentence fell into the air like ash. No cheer, no gasp, just a deep silence that seemed to stretch forever. Some women stared blankly at the ground. Others looked toward the sky as if searching for the next command. A few covered their mouths, their shoulders shaking, though no sound came out. One woman began to laugh, a sharp, nervous laugh that broke into a sob. Keiko did not move. Her fingers dug into her palms, her breath shallow. The war that had built every rule she had ever lived by had ended without ceremony. Peace had arrived like an afterthought. Repatriation, the guards said later. That was the new word, strange and heavy in their mouths. It meant trains, ships, and return. But return to what? The world beyond the fence was foreign now. The war had swallowed the familiar and replaced it with smoke. The women whispered to one another in fragments. Would their homes still stand? Would their families welcome them, or turn away in shame? In Japan, surrender was not survival. It was disgrace. Days passed in uneasy quiet. Routines blurred as the guards dismantled parts of the camp. Trucks arrived carrying crates instead of soldiers. The fences remained, but their purpose felt hollow. Keiko helped wash the last of the uniforms, the smell of soap clinging to her hands. Each night she packed and unpacked her small cloth bag, as if testing whether she could still control anything at all. Inside it were a bar of soap, her notebook of secret letters, and the small piece of sackcloth with 2 words in crooked English. Keep blooming. The cowboy did not appear for several days. His usual path along the fence stayed empty. Each morning she found herself glancing toward the water pump, half expecting to see him there, adjusting a strap, pretending to be busy. He wasn't. The absence grew heavier than the heat. Then one evening, as the sky burned orange behind the barracks, she saw him near the main gate. He stood apart from the others, hat low, arms folded, watching the horizon. She stopped in the shadow of the laundry tent, unsure whether to approach. He didn't move. The wind tugged at his sleeve. For a long time they stayed like that, 2 silhouettes divided by wire and silence. When he finally turned away, She understood that was his goodbye. That night, sleep refused her. The barracks were filled with quiet movements. Women folding blankets, murmuring prayers, pretending to plan for a future none could imagine. Keiko sat on her bunk, the sackcloth pressed between her hands. She wanted to write one last page in her notebook, but words felt too fragile. The sentence "keep blooming" was enough. She lay down and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The day of departure arrived with mechanical precision. Trucks rolled into the yard, their engines humming like insects. The guards called names from a clipboard. When hers was spoken, she stepped forward automatically, her feet heavier than they should have been. She carried only her small bag. Her uniform, freshly washed, smelled faintly of sun. The women climbed into the truck bed one by one, some clutching photographs, others carrying nothing at all. The wheels creaked, and the camp gates opened with a groan that sounded like the world exhaling. As the truck moved, the wind lifted her hair. Dust rose in a long trail behind them. She did not wave. No one did. The barracks shrank into shapes of wood and shadow, then disappeared behind the line of trees. For a moment, she thought she heard music again, a faint note carried on the wind, but it was only memory. She reached into her bag, touched the folded scrap, and felt the paper edges against her palm. Keep blooming. The journey home took weeks. First trains, then ships. The ocean was endless and grey, its waves breaking like whispered confessions. The women spoke little, their voices muted by exhaustion. Some stared at the horizon for hours, their eyes reflecting nothing. Keiko spent her nights on deck, standing near the railing where the air was cold and sharp. Each sunrise felt both familiar and foreign, as if the world itself were relearning how to breathe. When Japan finally appeared, it was not the country she remembered. The port was half destroyed, cranes bent like broken limbs, warehouses burned to their frames. Smoke still lingered over the ruins. The first step onto the dock was heavier than any step she had taken in Texas. She looked around and saw only silence. Not peace, not relief, just emptiness. The air smelled of ash, not salt. She found her family after 2 days of searching. The house stood crooked but standing, walls patched with old cloth, windows missing. Her mother gasped when she saw her, then began to cry, not from joy, but from shame. Her father looked smaller, his shoulders bowed under invisible weight. He did not speak. Her mother's first words cut sharper than any blade. You lived, you surrendered. Keiko bowed deeply, her forehead almost touching the floor. Yes, she said quietly, I lived. There was no welcome meal, no embrace. That night she slept on a mat in the corner of the house, her uniform folded neatly beside her. Her mother's footsteps echoed down the hall long after she stopped moving. She stared at the cracked ceiling and listened to the wind pushing against the empty frames where windows once were. The sound reminded her of the harmonica, faint and wavering, as if the air itself was trying to remember a song. She never told them about Texas. Not about the food or the garden or the kindness that had crossed a fence. In Japan, mercy was suspicion, and survival was guilt. She swallowed her memories and let them settle deep inside, where no one could find them. Yet some nights, when the air was still, she would reach into her jacket and touch the folded note. The words never faded. They lived beneath her heartbeat. Steady and quiet war had ended, but something else had begun. An understanding that peace was not the absence of pain, but the decision to carry it gently. The cowboy's voice lingered in her mind, the way he had said her name once without demand or pity. Magnolia. It was more than a flower now. It was the proof that even in captivity she had not turned to stone. When sleep finally came, she dreamed of the Texas sky, wide and bright, a place that had no memory of bombs, only dust, wind, and a song played for her in the dark. The village had once been beautiful. Keiko remembered it as a place of quiet lanes and rice paddies that shimmered in the sun like mirrors. Now it lay wounded, scarred by the hand of war. Roofs gaped open to the sky. The market was nothing but a stretch of ash. The temple bell that had once marked the passing of each day hung crooked, its mouth filled with silence. Even the air seemed weary, carrying the heavy smell of smoke and damp soil. Keiko walked through what remained of home as if moving through a dream. Every step echoed in her bones. The children stared from doorways, whispering the word Haikuman, traitor. The elders looked away, their eyes full of pity that disguised judgment. She kept her gaze low, her shoulders square. The uniform she had worn on the ship home was folded now into a single bundle under her arm, but even out of it she carried its weight. Her family had survived, though survival had not softened them. Her mother refused to meet her eyes for days. She busied herself with chores that no longer needed doing, sweeping the same corner until the floorboards shone. Her father, thinner and older than she remembered, sat by the window each evening and stared toward the hills where the sky burned orange. He had once been proud of his daughter, the nurse who went to serve the emperor. Now he could not say her name. The silence inside the house was sharper than any reprimand. When Keiko tried to help, her mother pulled the basket from her hands and said nothing. At night, the walls seemed to breathe around her, the ghosts of what had been murmuring in the cracks. She lay on a thin mat near the back door, where the cold air slipped in, and stared at the ceiling until the stars faded. Each sound outside, the flap of cloth, the soft drip of rain, brought back the rhythm of Texas nights when the harmonica played beyond the fence and kindness had been possible. Once, she tried to tell her mother about the camp. She mentioned the garden and the taste of bread, baked with real flour, but her mother's eyes hardened before the words could finish. "Do not speak of them," she said quietly. "They took everything from us." Keiko lowered her head, the unfinished story dying in her throat. Her mother did not understand that not everything they took was stolen by force. Some things had been given, and freely. A meal, a name, a song. Her brother, now grown, avoided her. Once, late at night, she heard him arguing with their father. The words were low but fierce. "She should not have come back," he said. "People talk. They will think she betrayed the country." Her father did not answer. The pause that followed was worse than anger. Keiko began to spend her mornings in the small patch of earth behind the house. The soil was poor and thin, but she coaxed small green shoots from it. Daikon, carrots, and one fragile magnolia sapling that a traveling cousin had brought as a gift. He did not know the meaning it held for her. When she placed it in the ground, her hands trembled. The petals were white, wide and trembling in the wind. Too beautiful for a place still learning how to forgive itself. The seasons changed slowly. The magnolia tree grew, though its trunk bent slightly as if unsure of belonging. In winter, snow settled on its bare branches, softening its shape. In spring, it bloomed, defiant and pale against the grey of their yard. Each petal that fell reminded Keiko of a page torn from her notebook, of words she could never share. One afternoon, she found herself alone in the garden, the air cool and still. She reached into the pocket of her worn jacket and drew out the small piece of sackcloth she had carried since the camp. "Keep blooming." The words were faded now, nearly lost to time, but she could still trace them with her fingertips. She held it for a long moment, then tucked it beneath the roots of the magnolia. "There," she whispered, "you can rest now." That evening her mother called her inside for tea. It was the first time. She had spoken to her, without command or reproach. They sat across from each other, the steam rising between them like a fragile bridge. For a while neither spoke. Then her mother sighed and said, "You always were too gentle." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't accusation either. It was something in between, a small acknowledgement that gentleness could survive, even where pride had burned everything else. Keiko nodded, her eyes on the window where the magnolia swayed in the fading light. "The world was cruel, Mother," she said softly, "but not everyone was." Her mother didn't answer, but her hands stopped shaking as she poured the tea. That night, Keiko sat beneath the tree, its blossoms faintly glowing in the moonlight. The wind moved through the branches with the same low hum she had once heard in Texas. She closed her eyes and saw the cowboy standing by the fence, his hat pulled low, the harmonica shining in his hand. His voice echoed in memory, slow, steady, unashamed. "Magnolia." She whispered the name into the air, and it drifted upward like smoke until it vanished among the stars. For the first time since returning, she smiled. Not the forced curve of obedience she had practiced in her youth, but a real, quiet smile that came from somewhere beneath the ache. It did not erase the pain, but it allowed the possibility of peace. The war had taken her name, her country, and her certainty, Yet in the end it had left her something unbreakable, the memory of kindness that no shame could erase. In the darkness, the magnolia petals shifted in the wind, falling one by one like slow snow. Each landed softly on the ground, pale against the black soil, proof that beauty could still belong to ruin. Keiko watched until her eyes blurred. When the last petal fell, she whispered a prayer not for victory or forgiveness, but for remembrance, because sometimes the only mercy left is to remember the gentleness that the world forgot. It passed quietly, the way seasons fade when no one marks the days. Time had softened the edges of war, but not its echo. The old wounds still lived in the silences between conversations, in the way people hesitated before laughter, in the way the horizon still smelled faintly of smoke after rain. Keiko had learned to live inside that silence. She no longer waited for forgiveness, she simply built her life beneath it. The countryside had become her refuge. The small house she moved to stood between two fields, one of rice and one of wild grass. Each morning she woke to the low murmur of wind pushing through bamboo and the cry of cranes circling above the paddies. Her hair had turned silver at the edges, and the lines around her eyes carried the map of every place she had been silent when she wanted to speak. Yet her movements were still deliberate, her hands still precise, her voice still calm. In front of her house stood the magnolia tree. It had grown tall now, its branches reaching higher each spring. The bark was rough but alive, the blossoms white and wide, opening each year as if unaware of the ruin from which they had once come. It bloomed early, before the cherry trees, before the grasses turned green. Each time it flowered, the village children would wander past and marvel at it. They called it the ghost tree, because it stood alone in a patch of soil too poor for anything else. Keiko smiled when she heard them. She never told them it had once been planted from a memory, or that beneath its roots lay a scrap of cloth that carried two faded words. Her children had grown. Her daughter lived in Osaka now, teaching school. Her son worked in a workshop that made radios. They wrote to her often, their letters filled with ordinary things. Train delays, weather, the price of fish. None of them knew the whole story of her life. She had given them fragments, enough to honor the truth but not enough to burden them with it. When they called her strong, she smiled and said nothing. Strength, she knew, was only the name given to those who had learned to endure. On quiet afternoons, she tended the garden the way she once tended the wounded, carefully, patiently, with a kind of reverence. The earth rewarded her labor with small mercies, daikon that grew straight, beans that curled around the fence, peas that opened like tiny prayers. And always, beside them, the magnolia tree watched, its blossoms drifting across the ground like folded letters from another life. Inside the house, there was a drawer she never allowed anyone to open. It held no treasure, only memories too heavy for display. Inside lay a harmonica, tarnished but whole. It had taken her years to find one that matched the sound she remembered. Not the same, but close enough. The first time she played it, she cried, not for the man who had once held it, but for the part of herself that had dared to listen. The sound came out uneven, shy, trembling through the dust-filled room. It was not music exactly. It was a breath that remembered being a song. Beneath the harmonica rested a folded letter, yellowed and creased at the edges. It was the one she had written in Texas, the first letter she had never mailed. The paper still smelled faintly of soap and sun. She read it once a year, always on the day she had returned home, as if to remind herself that survival, however painful, was still a form of defiance. The words blurred now, but she could still make them out. Today, someone called me something beautiful. Every time she read that line, her chest tightened, and for a moment she felt young again. The feel of dust under her feet, the scent of bacon in the mess hall, the soft murmur of a voice calling her by a name that had no rank, no duty, only warmth. Sometimes, on warm evenings, the neighbors would stop by for tea. They called her Kayo-san now, a name softened by affection. Once, a woman said, "You carry yourself with such grace." Keiko had only smiled and poured more tea. She did not tell her that grace was a thing learned not from victory, but from loss. She did not speak of the camp, or the garden beyond the wire, or the way kindness had felt like a forbidden language she had once learned to speak. But when the guests left, and the house grew quiet again, She would sit by the window and let her thoughts drift back across the ocean, to the fields of Texas, to the endless blue sky, to a voice that had said keep blooming and meant it. As the years folded into decades, the war became a memory others studied in books. People built new monuments, new stories, new ways of forgetting. But in her heart, Keiko carried the small truths that history never records, the weight of a bar of soap offered without suspicion, the warmth of bread shared in silence, the sound of rain mixing with music. These were not the victories of nations, they were the victories of people, and those she knew are the ones that endure. One spring, when she was old enough that the world began to look younger around her, she sat beneath the magnolia tree with a cup of tea cooling beside her. The petals fell slowly, catching in her hair, white against grey. She looked up at them and smiled, remembering the man with the hat, the dust on his boots, and the harmonica in his hand. She never knew his name, but she knew what he had given her. In a world divided by fear, he had seen her not as a number, not as an enemy, but as something living, something human. As the afternoon light faded, Keiko reached out and caught one of the falling petals in her palm. It rested there lightly, trembling. "I have kept blooming," she whispered, and for a moment she imagined that somewhere, across the years and the ocean, a man might have heard her. The wind rose, scattering the blossoms across the yard. They swirled around her feet like snow. She closed her eyes and listened. The breeze carried a faint sound, one long, wavering note, thin and pure.